I've lived long enough to remember the 1960s when the idea of a beginning and a singularity was firmly resisted by the British scientific establishment because it seemed to lend too much support to what the Bible was saying. It's sad to me, the extremes to which people will go to deny, to be against God. I'm not only not an atheist because I'm a Christian, I'm not an atheist because I'm a scientist. I don't think there's an even level of argument whatsoever.
Hello and welcome along to Unbelievable Live with me, Justin Brierley, and very excited to be bringing you John Lennox tonight on the show. If you've never joined us before, well, that's because we've never had one of these Unbelievable Live webinars before. This is new for us. We're very excited to be able to bring you more of these opportunities as well in the coming year as we expand the work of Premier Unbelievable in various ways. And tonight we have the pleasure of John Lennox's company. John hardly needs an introduction, but he is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Oxford University, a noted Christian thinker, and of course has debated many of the world's leading atheists. His most recent book is Cosmic Chemistry: Do Science and God Mix? Hello, John. How are you doing?
Hello, Justin. I'm doing very well and delighted to be with you as usual.
It's so wonderful to have you with us. Really looking forward to all the questions that will be coming in as well. Lots of people joining the webinar as we speak. And we also want to tell you tonight about a very special film. John has had his life and work captured on film recently in the movie documentary Against the Tide. And we're so pleased to be partnering tonight with Kharis Productions and Pensmore Films. They're the producers of that film. And we'll be chatting later on to the director, Iain Morris, about it and giving you a little taster of the film as well. But most importantly tonight, we want you to submit your questions to John, and you can do that via the Q&A facility that you'll find on your Zoom browser. Now you can feel free to use the chat to tell us where you are and to talk amongst yourselves. But if you want to ask a question, you'd need to do it in the Q&A. That's the way to get your question to us. And you can also upvote questions as well that other people have submitted, and that will help me to prioritize which are the most important questions to be asking John. So as we start to see some of those questions come in, John, why don't we talk a little bit about this new book, Cosmic Chemistry? Now, you write so many of these books, I can't keep up, quite honestly, John, but I think this one actually is a reworking of one of your early titles, God's Undertaker. I think that was published probably nearly 15 years ago now. So tell us why you wanted to revisit this subject that it deals with, the supposed battle between science and faith.
Well, God's Undertaker was my first book of this type, and it was hard work. And I just didn't have the experience that I've been able to add during the past 15 or so years. And reflecting on that early book, I felt that, first of all, the subject has moved on. And secondly, I gained a lot of experience in debating the new atheists and giving lectures all around the world and trying to handle questions. And so I felt the time had come really to rewrite the thing completely from beginning to end. And I suppose the way I'd sum it up is referring to this year's Templeton Prize winner, Alvin Plantinga. He once said this: there is a superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion. But there's a superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism. And I wanted to deal with both of those aspects in this book and bring people up to speed. First of all, to bring Christians up to speed to show that their faith in God is intellectually defensible and they can use science to support it. But second, also to challenge people out there who may not yet have made up their minds, to show that there's perhaps more than they think to be discovered in looking at the big questions of existence in the light of science and faith in God.
Well, we're going to look at some of those questions obviously tonight. And when I read Cosmic Chemistry, I was just delighted, to see the way that you have brought so much of that wisdom that's been accumulated, obviously, in the years since you first wrote about it. Especially, I think, in the light of so many of the debates you've had. I mean, the original book, if you like, was published sort of as the new atheism was, picking up steam. Now, this many years on and having debated some of the key names from the new atheist, well, firstly, what are some of your most memorable moments in the years that you've been talking to these folk?
Well, I suppose that the most memorable was the original terror when I had to go on stage to face Richard Dawkins and similarly Christopher Hitchens at the Edinburgh Festival. And those were memorable times because I think, in spite of the fear and the panic and all the rest of it, I came to the conclusion that my task was to try, as I said to Dawkins on the very first debate, as we went out to debate just before we walked on stage, he said, "I don't debate." And I said, "Well, I don't really either. And my objective is simply to try to put a credible alternative to your atheism and let the people make up their minds." And he said, "I'll buy that." So that's been my motivation, not to win arguments or do people down, but to present the evidence as I see it and to be respectful and thoughtful about my opponent's view. In other words, I try to act as you do in your show Unbelievable.
Well, that's very kind to say. I very vividly remember when in the second of those two discussions you had with Lennox, you went to the Natural History Museum at Oxford, and you were framed by this hulking Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton behind you as you debated. It was a super metaphor, and a very appropriate place to do things. It was probably, I don't know, 150 years previous maybe that Wilberforce and Huxley had debated there, wasn't it?
That's right, and that was quite an evening because Dawkins came out all guns blazing. And nevertheless, what I found so encouraging about that particular evening is the number of people that subsequently came to faith in God through watching that debate.
Yeah.
And that makes it all worthwhile,
Well, look, perhaps in the questions, we'll see the way things have moved on in terms of some of the questions people want to ask tonight. Just before we start taking those questions, I want to let you know about if you want more in-depth training from John. He's actually featured as one of several Christian thinkers in our new online Confident Christianity course from Unbelievable. It's available on the Udemy learning platform, and it's all for teaching from our Unbelievable conferences over the years. So we have a special discount code, 30% off, just for tonight's event. The link is going to appear in the chat if you want to get hold of that. But we will make sure to send links through to everyone as well via our newsletter in the coming week. But again, if you want to ask a question, now is a good time to pop it in the Q&A. I can see lots are already stacking up for us there. You can upvote other people's questions as well. That helps to, give me a sense of what you'd most like us to talk about. And if you see a question sort of go into, suggest that it's been answered, but it hasn't been answered, it's just because I'm collating them. And that helps me to sort of decide on which questions that we're gonna tackle. Here's a great opening question, John. This is Klaus, who asks, what makes you doubt God and how do you deal with that? Does John Lennox ever doubt? That's the question.
Well, you see, John Lennox is by nature quite a skeptical person. And the problem with the use of the word doubt is that many people think of doubt as a great black hole which is about to engulf us psychologically and we'll never get out of it. But dubitare, from which the word doubt comes in Latin, simply means to be in two minds. And I have spent my life questioning my own position, my worldview, my faith in God. And the result of doing that all the time has been that I feel the evidence has grown and grown and grown. So if you like, my convictions are based on what Descartes would probably have called systematic doubt. I ask questions about everything, and constantly I meet questions to which I have no immediate answer. And therefore, I like to feel that the Christian faith can really face questions, and that's where strength actually comes from. So if you say, does John Lennox ever doubt? Certainly in that kind of way, in that he's always questioning himself.
Here's another interesting one from Marcos. What are some of the theological views that you grew up with that you no longer hold? Obviously, like everyone, I'm sure your thinking develops and evolves. Is there anything you grew up with that you'd now say, actually, I've changed my view on that?
Very few, actually, because my parents were unusually open and didn't force any particular set of convictions down my throat, so to speak. And my father, although not having enjoyed an education remotely as advanced as mine, nevertheless always put himself in the position where he queried things. And so I was taught to query everything. And as I look back, I don't see many pillars, so to speak, in my theological foundation that have been anything but strengthened over the years. I presume there are nuances in understanding various things, but even in fairly extreme things like interpretation of prophecy and all this kind of thing, I was allowed, even as a teenager, indeed not only allowed but encouraged, to think very widely and read very widely. So I never felt I was in a straitjacket. And so I haven't, in that sense, had to violently revise any of my understandings of the scripture.
Another personal question before we come to some of the sort of the scientific questions, and this comes from our chat about some of the debates you've had. But Peter wants to know, do you ever feel anxious when debating? And if so, how do you manage it?
Well, if you don't feel anxious, you'd better not enter the arena because nerves are important, but there are two kinds of nervousness. And it's very important to distinguish between them. There's the nervousness of how am I going to look? That is a function of pride and this kind of thing. But there's a nervousness that comes from a sense of responsibility. Here I am publicly representing Christianity, and my prayer is, Lord, help me not to blow it. So we need to clear the first out of the way, but it's very important to have that sense that you've got a real responsibility and you need to take it seriously, which is why I spend such an amount of time, or did in advance of these debates, getting to know what my opponents think, because they deserve that in that sense. Nervous, yes, but I've learned to deal with the first thing, but I've learned not to lose the second.
Very good, very good. Now, moving on to the question of God and the arguments for God. There's a really interesting question from Kate here, who asks, would you argue for God's existence on the basis of beauty, for example, in nature or in mathematics? And if so, how would you go about formulating that sort of an argument?
Well, I think this is a very important consideration, that as human beings, we've got that capacity to appreciate beauty. And if we take the biblical explanation of that seriously, it's part of our constitution. In Genesis, it tells us God made the trees good to look upon, by human beings, presumably. So he's set that sense of beauty and order and so on in our hearts. And it is a simple fact that the great mathematicians, astronomers of the past, they looked up at the heavens and they saw a beauty, and coupled with that, they saw an order. And that indicated to them that the most rational explanation of this was that there was a beautiful ordering mind behind the universe. And it was the great Paul Dirac at Cambridge who said an equation to be true, something like this, must be beautiful. And I think there is a beauty in mathematics. And C.S. Lewis, I think, makes the point in various places of that beauty that inspires longing, that there must be something outside of this, beyond this. Now, how far beauty takes you is another matter, but I think it is a very important dimension that we can look upwards towards a mind that has set that beauty and that sense of eternity in our hearts. So I think it is important.
Here's another interesting question, and I think this to some extent focuses on, I think, the resurgence of a sort of pantheistic view. It's especially coming through in some of the sort of theories about consciousness and so on that are floating around today, John. But Olivier says, hello, Mr. Lennox. Have you ever contemplated the idea that the living universe itself could be God? And I'm hearing this more and more, I must say, in from people who can't buy into the materialist view, the physicalist view, if you like, but they're not willing to go the theistic view, and they're turning towards a sort of pantheism where they say, well, maybe, you know, the consciousness is somehow embodied in the universe around us, and that is what I mean by God when I speak of God and so on. What's your view on that, John?
Well, this is a perspective that I meet also that many people hold, and my response is to say, what is the evidence that the universe is God? And what then do you mean by God? Are you simply placing the word God on the universe? And where does that exactly get you? And where I sit in all of this is that I can understand people when they say that. But what is that going to do for our sense of our own position in the cosmos, if you like? Because, you see, pantheistic philosophies tend to conflate the universe and God in an impersonal, ultimate reality. And I think that's almost the polar opposite of the Christian revelation, that God is a personal being who created the universe but is distinct from it. And that makes much more sense to me. But people must make up their own minds. I hope they make up their minds on the basis of evidence, though.
Now, John, you may not be aware of this, but the most recent Unbelievable show we did dealt with the sort of question of God's sovereignty. And I know you've written on this yourself in your book, Determined to Believe, ? You, in that book, you come out quite strongly against Calvinism. But on my most recent show, I brought William Lane Craig and James White together to debate the Calvinist view held by James White and Molinism held by Bill Craig. Fantastic discussion, and many people have now watched that on YouTube. There seems to be a lot of interest among those gathered here to get your view on Molinism. So this one from Dustin has been upvoted by a great number of people and says, I'm aware of Professor Lennox's defense of the free will criticism of determinism, and I'm curious what your view of Molinism is. I'm not necessarily looking for you to affirm it entirely, but more interested in whether you consider it to be a legitimate, biblically backed belief. And just for the sake of those who may not know what Molinism is, I'll try and give a very potted idea, but it's essentially a view that tries to reconcile human freedom with God's ultimate ability to bring about his purposes. And it's through this concept of what's sometimes called middle knowledge, that God knows all the possible things that would happen if you placed free people in different sets of circumstances. And then God instantiates that particular world that brings about his ultimate purposes, but yet still what people are doing is freely responding. It's just God has set them in a situation in which he knows exactly what they would do under those circumstances. It's a somewhat nuanced philosophical understanding, but what's your view on this way of trying to reconcile human freedom and divine sovereignty, John?
I suspect more people would be interested in Molinism if that word wasn't used. In the sense that it tends to sound to people as an ism. And the idea of Molina, in what I have read, appears to be a notion that Christ himself affirmed, because in his famous upbraiding of the cities on the plain which were destroyed, he said, if Tyre and Sidon had the evidence you've had, if the mighty works that were done had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented. Now, it seems to me, whether you call that Molinism or not, it is telling us that the Lord knows what people would have done with evidence if they'd got it. And I think that's a thoroughly a scriptural notion, whether you call it Molinism or not. So it does have something going for it, something very important, because I want to take those scriptures seriously, however difficult they are to get your head around, and they are very difficult to get your head around.
It sounds then that you're quite sympathetic to Molinism as a potential way.
Well, I'm sympathetic because I believe those statements that Christ made. And it's clear, if you want to call that middle knowledge, well, that's fine, so long as you define it to be something like that. But of course, you know as well as I do that this is an immensely complex business. And the difficulty is we sit inside ourselves, and it's very difficult to work out some of the aspects of this. And I have written my book, and I'm very interested in the responses to it. And I haven't seen any reason in arguments that have been sent to me to retract very much of it. I might modify a little bit of it with time, but I'm not ready to do that yet.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it when it came out, and Matt has left in the chat that he's almost done with Determined to Believe and says it's amazing. So you have a thumbs up from
Oh,
Matt,
that's very kind. Thank you, Matt.
Let's talk about some of the evidences that you do talk about in the way that you don't believe there's a conflict between science and faith in cosmic chemistry. In particular, Martin says, firstly, have you heard of the book Decoding Reality by Oxford professor Vlatko Vedral? And whether or not you have, could you comment on the role of information in our understanding of the world and in the God-science debate?
Well, I've read the book. I have it sitting on my shelf here. And the role of information is absolutely vital. These days, I have a habit of talking about the universe and the cosmos as an information-based world. And I see that at several levels. First of all, we have the natural sciences, physics, astronomy, astrophysics, where we discover that the language of mathematics gives us so much of an ability to describe what's going on out there. So in that sense, it's word-based. And then coming to biology, genetics has revealed to us the longest word that we've ever discovered, the human genome, the genetic code. So there in biology, word is used. And that resonates very deeply with the first statement in the Gospel of John: in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through the Word. So this universe, according to the New Testament, is word-based. And Genesis, in its simpler language, simply says, and God said, and God said. So a logos, a speaking, makes perfect sense. Now, what needs to be noticed there is that we live in an information age. And we've come to the point where physicists are generally agreed that information is an irreducible feature of our universe. And it's not reducible to physics and chemistry. And that, for me, would be enough to dispel materialism once and for all. So this is a hugely important concept. And I spend a lot of time discussing it in my new book, Cosmic Chemistry.
I mean, turning from the information that we find perhaps in nature, at a biological level, to the fact that there is a universe at all. An interesting question from Hyde here, who says, in Brian Cox's new BBC series, Universe, he talks about a theory of before the beginning of the universe, a pre-Big Bang, where pre-universe existence was pure energy. Something happened, this energy somehow manifested materially, and the universe was born. Now, if you excuse the bad explanation, I'm curious to hear your perspective on that theory, how well attested it is in the scientific community, and what implications that might have on a Christian worldview of cosmology.
Well, sometimes I wish I were a cosmologist. I try to understand what they say. But you see, I'm a mathematician. And because I'm a mathematician, I suppose I take most seriously of all what the mathematicians say about this. And there's a very famous result by Alan Guth and Sergei Vilenkin and Alan Board. 3 people. I've met 2 of them and discussed it with them. And from a mathematical perspective, they argue that whether you talk about a universe or a multiverse or whatever, you do have a beginning. So whether Brian Cox has factored that into a series, I just don't know. But it seems to me that there we have, and I word myself carefully here because science changes, of course, but we've got a strong convergence between the biblical revelation in the beginning, there was a beginning, and where science has got us to. And I actually discuss that in some detail but in my book because I think it's immensely important, because I've lived long enough to remember the 1960s when the idea of a beginning and a singularity was firmly resisted by the British scientific establishment because it seemed to lend too much support to what the Bible was saying. So what we can say is at the moment there seems to be a convergence. Now things do change, but we can only deal with what we see at the moment and not make our life depend on them.
Mm-hmm. Just one more question before we go to our partner today, Against the Tide, and get a little glimpse of the film that you've been involved in. But sticking with this question of eternity, Paraskeva, I think I'm pronouncing the name correctly, says, we've been taught in school that eternal means something with no beginning and no end. How do you define the term eternal, and what makes the human soul eternal, given it does have a beginning?
Yes. These words we need to be quite careful with, because sometimes we translate eternal and we're translating a word that means age long. And I would prefer to go at it the other way. As T.F. Torrance would have said, how does God reveal himself? He reveals himself as a God who has always existed. And if you want to say that's eternal, well, then I'm very happy with that. But absolutely clearly, we have a beginning. And the Greeks were fascinated by this, and so am I. The difference in category between things that are eternal, like God, and things that came to exist. And of course, William Lane Craig is the great expert on discussing that difference. And we came to be. And what Scripture claims is we came to be through the Word, but the Word never came to be, which I take it to be the force of the initial statement in John's Gospel. In the beginning, the Word already was.
Well, great questions so far. Do feel free to keep them coming. We're going to have some more questions in a moment. In the Q&A is where you need to post them. Feel free to upvote other people's questions as well if you think that there are some that you'd like to see answered by John. Now, tonight's event is brought to you in partnership with Kharis Productions and Pensmore Films. They are the producers of Against the Tide. And in a moment, I'm going to be speaking to the director of the film, Iain Morris, who's going to join the conversation. But first of all, here's a sneak peek at the film.
Why there is something rather than nothing is a huge question today.
Belief in God does not really help us.
Religion teaches us to be satisfied with not really understanding.
I believe the exact opposite. God, far from being a delusion, is real.
Religion is a fiction that just is never challenged.
I believe that the public need to hear that there is another side.
And that's why I'm here to have you help me to understand and follow the evidence.
I do argue that there is evidence for the existence of an intelligent God behind the universe. Christianity answers the question, who is this God?
How do we know that God came here in basically human form? How do we know that?
Why don't we meet in the place where it all began?
What about the resurrection?
Now, I don't normally need 5 minutes to rebut the resurrection.
The resurrection possesses unrivaled explanatory power.
John, I sense that you truly believe this.
I'm convinced of it, not simply as a Christian, but as a believing scientist.
There you go. It's a great film. I've had the chance to see it myself. And it's great to be joined now by Iain Morris, the director, who's going to join in the conversation with myself and John. Iain, thank you for this film. I know it got its release a little while ago, but it's great to be featuring it tonight. Tell us a little bit about the film. What is it, ultimately about? What are the main themes that you've tried to sort of produce in this film?
Thank you for inviting me, Justin. But I feel apologetic for interrupting such a great conversation as you've been having with John. But as you know, I had the great privilege of working with him over quite some time to make Against the Tide, which is really a film that brings you the evidence for Christianity, for Christian faith, but in a film made for cinema. And you asked what's really in it. Well, first of all, we focus on science and how it points to God as the ultimate explanation for our existence. But then it moves on to discuss the evidence from history that Jesus of Nazareth was God revealed to us in human form. He was real, and we believe we can substantiate that belief. And all of this is mediated through an exploration that's carried out between John and his partner, who suddenly arrives in his life, a Hollywood actor called Kevin Sorbo. Now, if you think walking around with John Lennox is interesting, you should try walking around with Kevin Sorbo. Everywhere we went, he was besieged by people, as John reminded me earlier, some of them Japanese tourists, anxious for his autograph. So it's a serious film, but it was a lot of fun to make.
Yeah, fantastic. So these are the two themes that really come out in the film, the evidence for God, but also the evidence for Christianity. Why did you want to bring those two particular themes together, John? And I suppose that's been much of your life. As much as you're known for science, you're also known for your, linking it to the Christian story itself, aren't you?
Well, because each of these is an essential part of a whole. Very frequently, when I give a talk about the evidence for God from a scientific perspective, the logical and perfectly justified question that people will ask is, but look, you're a Christian. How do you make the leap from whatever kind of theism it is you get to on the basis of scientific evidence? How do you make the leap to Christianity? And the point I make is that you have to go beyond the natural sciences to two things, to history and to human experience. And really what I devoted the film to was the rationality of the Christian revelation about God.
Tell us about the title. Against the Tide is the title. What is the tide exactly that's being referred to there? Iain, why don't you take that one, and we'll have John's thoughts as well.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, Justin. And I think the tide can make many forms. Let me start with just one, an obvious one: open hostility to Christianity. I think this has become associated with new atheism, people who are not so prominent these days, but who have a lasting legacy in our culture and in the minds of people. And this idea that theism, the belief in God, is pretty much a nonsense thing. I remember in a series that we made a little while back, in which featured John, a series called Exploring the God Question, where we bring together a number of atheists and theists. One of the atheists, Peter Atkins, describes scientists who are believers in God as folk who have had some kind of problem in their childhood, probably. And that's their issue. Well, that's pretty hostile. As you know from your experience, Justin, Peter is never one to understate his case.
That's one way of putting it, mildly.
But it's this idea that, science has told us so much that God is not necessary, and people who cling to this silly belief are somewhat intellectually immature.
Yeah, I mean, I was thrilled when I watched the film to see that a few unbelievable debates that John has participated in were featured in part. I mean, that Lawrence Krauss discussion, John, do you remember that one? I suppose that to some extent arguably is one example of someone who is not just, talking about science, that they are quite anti-theistic in the way they approach the whole thing.
Well, Lawrence Krauss was vigorously anti-theistic, and I'll never forget that discussion, because it just demonstrates, it's sad to me, the extremes to which people will go to deny, to be against God. This was the famous discussion where he tried to redefine nothing, a universe from nothing. And he made this famous statement in his book, since something is physical, nothing must also be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. To which my wry comment is, nonsense remains nonsense, even if scientists talk it. But it's a pity to have to revert to nonsense to avoid considering a rational explanation in terms of a creator.
Iain, tell us about sort of how the film came together, where you went to shoot it. It obviously took you sort of to different parts of the world, didn't it?
Well, it did. Although one part of the world that was very significant in the film was Oxford. We focused our attention in Oxford as a place where we could really explore the scientific ideas with John and with Kevin. We also used quite a lot of archive in the film, which takes you elsewhere. Northern Ireland, for one, in the 50s, associated with John's childhood. Because one of the things the film does is to try to trace and track the influences in John's life and why he's ended up believing what he believes, and what was the road that he traveled in order to develop these well worked out ideas. So we also find ourselves on the heels of John in East Germany in the 60s, watching archive film of people trying to escape over the wall. Some of the filming from there was actually done by John himself on a high-8 camera. And John, I always meant to apologize for not giving you a credit as a cameraman at the end of the film. Forgive me. But we also go with John again to the Soviet Union, where he debated with atheist professors there. So this is also a biopic. And then ultimately, of course, we went to Israel to film the second half of the film, where Israel itself became almost the third character in the movie, as someone else pointed out. The wonderful majesty of old Jerusalem and the beauty of Galilee, which Kevin Sorbo describes as the gospel in technicolor. So yes, it's a journey that we go on, not just a journey of ideas, but a geographical journey as well.
Well, I can thoroughly recommend it. And it is really, a film fit for cinema. It has this wonderful cinematic quality to it. Really well produced, Iain. If people want to get hold of the film, where can they go? How can they support it? Where should we send people?
Well, one of the obvious places is via the web link, which you're going to supply. That's perhaps the easiest one, which will take you to the againstthetidemovie.org website. And you can navigate your way to buying the film from there, from revive.com and from amazon.com. And you can buy it on DVD, Blu-ray, or you can web stream it, which is something that many people do these days. So that's how you can acquire it. And when you do, then I hope you will not only view it, but use it. But you may have a question about that to come to you, Justin.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of ways you can follow up here. We have popped the link in the chat if anyone wants to just, copy and paste that, put it somewhere where you can go and watch it later. We will be following up with an email as well, to make sure that people have the link. And this particular link has special resources as well, specifically related to the kinds of questions we've been talking about tonight around science and faith. So it's really worth going and checking out. And again, it's againstthetidemovie.org/premiere. But thank you very much for being in the conversation with us this evening. It's been great to have you with us. So we'll leave that there, and we'll return to the questions, and they have been continuing to come in, lots of them. And I think we'll turn to some questions that, having talked about God and science, John, we'll come back to some of the questions now about specifically Christianity and the story itself in the Bible. Let's go right back to the beginning, and questions about ultimately Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge. So here's one, which I'm just trying to find it now. Here we go. Thinking about, we'll start with the virgin birth of Jesus. How did Jesus not inherit humanity's sin nature? Would Jesus have had any of Mary and Joseph's DNA? And if he didn't, what are the implications then of him being a descendant of David? This is Julie asking this question, John. Any thoughts on Jesus and his DNA and that whole question of original sin and so on?
Not really, because the whole question of inheritance and what is actually meant by original sin, which is not actually a biblical descriptor at all. It's clear from the Genesis account, which I believe, that through human rebellion against God, sin entered into the world. But the question of the damage that is caused and how it's transmitted is a different matter altogether. And the claim about the Lord Jesus is that he is utterly unique in that he had a human mother but did not have a human father. And this is completely supernatural. And what is involved in that is a complete mystery. But coming at it from a different perspective, what is stated of him, I believe, in him is no sin. He did no sin. He knew no sin. And even if we find that difficult, as of course many things are, real reality is complex. I think we have to face that. And we got to be careful about theories that would lead to a clash with that when we've no real evidence about them. And as to more detail on that, I've written about it in my book, Determined to Believe, exactly what effect sin had on human beings. That is the introduction of it in Genesis. That's a huge theological question for today.
You've tackled many a huge theological question, not least with another book of yours, 7 Days That Divide the World, looking at the story of creation and the early chapters of Genesis. A few questions on that as well. Donald asks, does Dr. Lennox believe Adam and Eve were literally the first humans? Now, you took a whole book to explain your answer here. What's the nutshell answer to this one?
Well, I do, yes, but that won't satisfy anybody because they want evidence why I believe it. I do think Christ himself referred to an original pair. And it's been interesting to me watching all the argument that's going on out there, some of which I understand, some of which I don't. But let me just say this, that my book, 7 Days That Divide the World, has been republished in an updated version just in the last few months, because I decided there were various things that needed to be adjusted a little bit and also things that needed to be added. But whether I've solved that problem satisfactorily, I personally see no reason to reject the concept of an original pair, because I believe that God intervened supernaturally in history, not very often, apparently, according to Genesis. You can list the statements, and God said, on the fingers of one or two hands. And therefore, since I believe that God intervened supernaturally at the incarnation and the resurrection, I don't see any in principle reason for disbelieving that God intervened at certainly the origin of life and at the origin of human beings. But again, I have to leave a more detailed explanation of what I've come to believe in my book, 7 Days. And of course, we all have to make up our own minds.
I had the happy pleasure of being asked to narrate the new version of 7 Days That Divide the World for the audiobook, John. So if anyone goes and listens to it, it's my voice they'll hear, but your words. So that was great to be able to do that. Another question on Genesis. This is from Jonathan. It says, what's the relationship between the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life? How do you see those sort of, are they imagery? You know, is that a metaphor? Do you think there really is something going on there with those two trees that are mentioned in Genesis?
Well, clearly the important thing is what they stand for. And I'm glad you said the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because there's so many people out there think it's the tree of knowledge, that God is against knowledge. And this has caused a huge confusion of thought. God is not against knowledge, but the knowledge of good and evil is something, obviously, from Genesis that you don't want to have. Now, I take it that the important thing is what they stand for. But the issue here is that there are certain indicators in the text itself that would make me hesitate before saying they're metaphorical, because once you use the word metaphor, the logical next question is, what do they stand for? And we're told that when human beings rebelled against God and sinned, they were expelled from this garden, which sounds like a geographical location, that they weren't allowed to have access to this tree of life, lest they should eat it and live forever. Now, what is very interesting about that is in virtually every nation under the sun, there are legends, the idea of an elixir of life, of some kind of something that you can eat and your life will be prolonged indefinitely. You may need to have access to this constantly. And if you put that against my medical friends who don't really know why we die, except they talk in terms of telomeres shortening and all this kind of stuff, it seems to me that it might be unwise to reject any kind of, if you like, first level literal understanding of it, provided you realize that the important thing is what it actually stands for. That God, there was a source of life, and because they went for the one thing in their pride and their desire to be as gods, which is coming very much full circle today with artificial intelligence and super intelligence and so on, that God prevented them from something else. And the tree of life does appear again in the book of Revelation, and what that exactly is, I just don't know.
Turning from those questions of the beginning in Genesis in the Bible to questions of evolution and how that ties in, a couple of interesting questions here. Now, Harry, first of all, with a general question on, do you believe in macroevolution? Yes or no answer, please, says Harry, but I'm sure you'll want to add a little bit more than that. And also, this from Jason was quite interesting. He says, my son, aged 15, was invited to take part in a further study course by Oxford University. It turned out to be from the biology department, emphasizing the need and importance of an evolutionary worldview, as they were hoping to enforce this view to 15-year-olds in schools, normally looking at things from the evolutionary worldview. Are they perhaps being shaken by intelligent design arguments, especially with input from people such as James Tour and yourself? So maybe we'll come to that interesting story there, and whether there is, intelligent design is causing some people to want to shore up evolutionary arguments. But how do you deal generally with macroevolution as a concept, John?
This is one of the reasons I wrote this new book, because there have been such vast leaps of understanding in biology that I think the general public, and particularly the Christian public, don't really know anything about. And it has to do with systems biology. Now, you asked me for a one-word answer. I can't give that. But what I can say is what Darwin observed, variations, cyclic variations, we see that all the time. So that natural selection, mutation do something. But to answer the next question as to whether the Darwinian, neo-Darwinian viewpoint holds, the interesting thing is that, let me give an example from my book, is that Richard Dawkins has repeatedly claimed, and this is probably behind the biology lesson you were talking about, that natural selection accounts for the form and existence of all living things? Well, first of all, it cannot account for existence because natural selection depends on the existence of life to do anything at all, whatever it does. But the second part is very shaky as well. Gerd Müller, who's head of the Department of Theoretical Biology in Vienna, says this: selection has no innovative capacity. So that's the end of some aspects of macroevolution. He goes on to say it eliminates or maintains what exists. The generative and ordering aspects of morphological evolution are absent from evolutionary theory. And Paul Davies in 2019, and Paul is not a theist, as you know, a brilliant physicist, but he says 20 years ago, this simplistic view of evolution began to crumble. And what has developed now, particularly in the hands of a colleague at Oxford, that is Professor Dennis Noble, that you've had on Unbelievable, is the systems biology approach. And the website of the third way of evolution, which he founded, is well worth looking at. It says this: the DNA record does not support the assertion that small random mutations are the main source of new and useful variations. We now know that the many different processes of variation involve well-regulated cell action on DNA molecules. So that what is happening now, as I understand it, and I emphasize, folks, I'm sorry I'm not a biologist, although I study these things in some detail, and I've gone to Dennis Noble's seminars some years ago, is that they've begun to see that it's not all bottom-up causation in biology, that the cell appears to be the main unit. And that, of course, leads to a profound chicken and egg problem. So I, as a mathematician, have always been very skeptical about the capacity of the things that are claimed natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, to do anything innovative. As Professor Sir Fred Hoyle pointed out long ago, and I've got his mathematical calculations sitting on my shelf. But now what is new, and what I include in my book, is that top biologists, Dennis Noble, professor here, fellow of the Royal Society, and a brilliant scientist, are questioning the neo-Darwinian model. And he says explicitly it doesn't need to be improved, it needs to be replaced. So the topic is wide open at the moment. And what systems biology has revealed is that DNA in its linguistic complexity is only the beginning of complexity. There's epigenetic levels on top of that. And to my mind, that points even more strongly to a designing intelligence.
So many questions that I wish we had time for, John, but we're into sort of the last 5 minutes really here. Maybe we'll go to Jordan next, who says there are good intellectual arguments for both Christianity and atheism. That being the case, it sometimes feels as if they reach a bit of a stalemate, and that to have Christian faith is simply making one's best guess. How can we be certain of the truth of Christianity when it seems like there are valid arguments against it and for other worldviews such as atheism?
I find generic questions like that difficult, because what are these valid arguments? We have to get down to details here, and I can understand the questioner getting a bit fed up with what appears to be a stalemate. I don't think it's that at all. And where my convictions have come from is a careful investigation of the arguments from both sides. And I find that to quote what I said at the very beginning, that actually the arguments for atheism are very weak, and they not only undermine Christianity, which you'd expect, they undermine science. And that is one of the reasons that I often say to people, I'm not only not an atheist because I'm a Christian, I'm not an atheist because I'm a scientist. I don't think there's an even level of argument whatsoever. And so we can only discuss detail. We can't discuss generalized things, and I'm afraid you've got some work to do to investigate the evidence, and I can't save you from that.
Jen asks, my dad is an atheist mathematician. Is there a particular John Lennox book you'd recommend? I'm hoping that the mathematical overlap background may open the willingness for my dad to read and have a conversation. Thanks in advance. And any particular work of yours or any others that might help to open the door here?
Well, the thing to avoid is recommend, because I meet many people who've got relatives that aren't believers and so on, and they ask me this question. I say, look, it's much better not to recommend any of my books, but to give your friend, if you feel that you've read one of the books that you think might be useful, and ask them to evaluate it. Because if you say to someone, this is a great book, well, you may be absolutely sure they will go in the exact opposite direction. You want to get something much more neutral than that. So I would just say, read through, and if you find something that you think is helpful, then share it and ask people for an opinion on it. And that's a very different thing. And maybe that will spark off a discussion, as I know for a fact it has done in many cases. And you might try something like, can science explain everything? Because that's one of the dominant problems I meet with atheists. They have got it into their heads that science will answer every question, and therefore there's no need for anything else. That's why I wrote that little book, which I can assure you is much more accessible than the original God's Undertaker.
And cosmic chemistry, of course, would be a good place for
yes, absolutely. It's much more advanced, but it's dealing with much more detail. Surely.
Indeed. Like, time's nearly out. So last question, John, and both Jack and Marcos asked a very similar question on this. You've answered many questions tonight, but what is the number one question you would like to ask God when you turn up at the pearly gates, John? What are you going to be asking God?
Well, I think my response will be just sheer amazement that God has mercy on me and has been so gracious and kind to me. It's that sheer wonder that of the love of God. And you see, this is where it all comes down. It's wonderful to talk about science and God and the historical evidence for Christianity. But this last question, it brings me down to the experience of God. And that means everything to me. If I didn't have that sense of really knowing God and knowing that I've got a future with God, not based on any merit of my own. This is the amazing thing. And the fact that God loved me, that will be foremost on my mind, I think, when I get there. It'll certainly not be a scientific question.
John, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. It's been a real treat having you for this first of our Unbelievable Lives. Thanks also to Iain and Kharis Productions and Pensmore Films for being with us as well. Do go and check out Against the Tide, again at the link that we were provided in the chat, but look out for more info about it coming your way soon. And if you want more from Unbelievable, do of course keep up to date via our podcast, our YouTube channel, our newsletter, and we have a very exciting another Unbelievable Live to announce in late January, a live edition of the show bringing Michaela Peterson and Sean McDowell together into conversation. And finally, don't forget that 30% discount on our Confident Christianity online course that features John's teaching as well. You can find, again, that in the link, and we will make sure to send you a follow-up email with all of the info. But thank you very much also for being with us tonight. Thanks for all the brilliant questions that have come in. And I'm really looking forward to doing more of these in the future. Really appreciate you being with us. And finally, have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. God bless you all. Bye-bye.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.